Today and joining us. My name is Holly Raj. I'm the Executive Director with St. Marguerite Bourgeoys FertilityCare. We teach the Creighton model to women, couples, and teens. And I'm also a very proud mom of two little girls sitting on the back there with their headphones on, 9 and 10 years old. And yes, my daughter is just waving her hands now. And I'd like to introduce our panel for today. We're talking about the family as a domestic church, looking inwards. We have Matthew Marquardt on the panel, who's a father. We also have Dr. Althea Barthos and Quinton. And I'll have each of them introduce themselves, and I will introduce some things that we're going to chat about today, and then we'll invite some questions from the crowd.
So I am Matthew Marquardt. I am mostly a retired lawyer at this point. I'm involved in a whole lot of Catholic initiatives, lots of boards, including FertilityCare. This is how I know lovely Holly here, and this is a lovely doctor next to me.
Hi, my name is Althea. I don't really need the microphone, but I can use the microphone. So I'm a doctor trained in pulmonary and sleep medicine, and I am married to Craig for almost 18 years, and we have 7 kids. And I have a lot of thoughts about that. I continue to work. I'm working part-time right now, so I'm happy to take any questions about that as well.
I'm Quinton Peralta-Grino. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Toronto in political theory, so that has nothing to do with this. I am a father of 2. My wife and I have been married for almost 4 years, so we have a 2 and a 2-month-old. And yeah, look forward to this.
So this is like a break now from...
Althea reminded me I should mention my husband and I are happily married 20 years in September, so I cannot forget that point. So for today, we're going to be talking about the role of parents as value givers, the role of siblings helping each other, and how the church may have a part in all of that. But I think, firstly, I want to ask the group here maybe about what they think the most important role of parents is in the family and the role parents have in parenting.
Well, I think both my own and the Catholic answer are that the parent is fundamental in raising the child. And what was it? So I think that, well, overall, I'd say the job of the parent is to help the child face life. And I think that as Catholics, we understand that the purpose of life is for us to look for the truth, which turns out to be God, and that our purpose in life is to get back to God as closely as we can. And as parents, it's our job to help our children understand that that's what this life is about. More maybe than chasing cars and homes and things like that. But also just help them understand that and help them get that there on their own. You know, they need the values they need in order to live that way and hopefully find the truth.
Can I make a comment about the domestic church? Okay, so this panel is on, family as domestic church, right? So in thinking about that, I asked myself the question, well, how do you define the domestic church actually? Because I think it's obvious if you have 7 kids and you're married that, okay, we can call that a domestic church, but what does it actually mean? So I think really we have to think about it as, communities of and communions of the baptized. And so it's not just necessarily parents with kids. I think we have to think a little bit more broadly. It could be 2 married people. It could be a single person caring for family members. So it's really the home that you make, and it is where 2 or more gathered in my name. There am I in the midst of them. So I think we also have to think broadly about what the domestic church can look like, and, you know, in our specific context, what does it look like?
I'm going to answer almost in the opposite way of Matthew, but I think it actually means the same thing. I'm a Byzantine Catholic, so our marriage ceremony is a little different. So in our rite of crowning, after the couple is formally married, it's been declared, you actually get up and you walk around this little table 3 times, and it's like your first dance. And during that, everyone in the church sings the hymn to the martyrs, which is very interesting. It's the first thing you do. Your first wedding dance is to a song about people who have died for Christ. And I think that would be the thing that I would take out, is that, yes, of course, that's in the marriage, but of course, the martyrdom really comes out when you have children. But then you want to teach them how to do that too. And I think that would be the thing that I would try to instill. It's like a death towards life. And that's what I would say we have to model as living a both of our marriages in and of themselves, but then as a parent as well.
Yeah, I like that, the white martyrdom of parenting and marriage, honestly. Not speaking for my own marriage in any way, but like, we are all called to greatness, and that means setting ourselves aside.
And maybe I'll just foreshadow a little bit. I did not do a very good job in selecting the mother of my children, and that had a very bad result. I ended up being a single father for most of my children's lives. And the process of becoming a single father was made far more difficult than it really needed to be, and a lot of damage was done. But in the end, by sticking with values of truth and love, we're doing really well now. So, yeah, I think that it's really important to understand the truth as you approach this project, and to seek it always and commit to it. But staying committed to the truth, you can get there anyway.
So yes, Matthew did a very good job of foreshadowing our next point about what values should we be teaching children, and what role can not just parents but extended family have in sharing that with children. Because it is very important when we talk about the domestic church, as Althea was referencing, we have more than just a mother and a father. Sometimes it's a single parent situation, grandparents, aunts and uncles, whether they be your own siblings, or whether they be close friends that become aunts and uncles to your children. What values should we be teaching them, and what are the role of the extended family as well?
And having already suggested that truth is the most important, I will just say that even in the very most difficult and challenging times, I always made it a practice to try to speak to my children in terms they would understand where I could, but if it involved deviating from the truth. I just tried to tell them the truth as best I know, bearing in mind that I'm an infallible human being. But I tried to share the truth with them as best I could, with the hope and the expectation that at some point they would have come to understand that I was doing that. And I will tell you that policy worked really well.
I think that trying to teach somebody values if they don't know that they are loved, and they don't know that they have value, and that you love them no matter what, and that you're invested in them, trying to teach them values is not going to be effective. So the values that we want to inculcate are downstream from the love in the family, and predominantly that love comes from God. And so how do you teach somebody that God loves them? Well, you have to love them, because if you don't love them, it's not a very good example of our Father in heaven who loves us. And I think it has to be from love first, and not from fear either. And we all fail at that. My daughter's in the audience. I'm sure she could tell you how often I fail at that myself, right? But we do have to operate out of love, and I think when people know that you care for them, they will want you to be happy with them, and they will want to do well. And the virtues we have in our society, the things that we think are good are not necessarily Christian virtues. But the basic decency in the Beatitudes, Matthew's Gospel, I think would be a good place to start. And then, the classical virtues. Maybe you can speak to that more.
I was going to go in a very different direction here and kind of just use my own example to say how difficult this can be. So my wife and I both come from broken homes. We're both very aware of this. And we come from it's crazy how different the brokenness can manifest itself. Our situations have almost nothing in common, and yet the brokenness is the same. And so both my parents were never married. You can see the dysfunction starting. And they're each married now. So I have 4 parents effectively, and then my wife's parents are both still single, but we effectively have 6 parents, and only one of them is a believing Catholic. Granted, he's one of the most pious men I know, so thanks be to God that it's him, but the other 5 aren't. And this makes parenting extremely difficult in terms of working with them. We also don't live in the same city with them, which I can't tell if that's a grace or not. I can't tell. But the real struggle, I think, for my wife and I has been trying to find the places where we can still see the virtues and goodness in our parents that don't necessarily align with us in a more complete vision, such that love is still possible. Because I have no doubt about the love my parents have for us and my children. Sometimes they say things that are, in my opinion, not loving. They don't think it is. We would have to disagree about it. But setting up structures where, my wife and I have had to be more deliberate about this in the last year or so, is setting up our own internal family structures, daily habits, more rigorous rituals around things that remind us of the depth of our faith. So whether that be Easter or Christmas, major feast days, we fast a lot in our tradition, so we already have little practices that we do for that. As ways of trying to show, okay, here's what our values are. We can even see these in others, even if they don't completely align with us, as a way of navigating this. The reason I bring that up is that I think it helps understanding, not only I know that this can sound a little bit utilitarian, but it's not only what the values are, but what they're for. Right? Why do we love all these kinds of things? And then, of course, the very weird part about this is that I have to hope that my children are witnesses to my parents, which is very weird. Very weird. Because I'm expecting my 2-year-old to be saintly, and that's bad, because he's not, and that's okay. But yeah, I'm just complicating things, that's all I'm doing.
Can I respond to that? I think that's great. So just concretely, without being very specific, in terms of the domestic church, one way that I have thought about it of late is with the idea of, priest, prophet, and king. So as a lay person, you can have that in your home, and so these things like the daily rituals, the daily prayers, is more like the priestly function of that. Prophetic function would be teaching the faith, witnessing to the faith, going out, and then kingship is kingship in the home and discipline, but it's also service. It's also service. So service within the home, and it's service to others. And so often when we think of the domestic church, we think of okay, well, what's our daily prayer? What is our daily internal family structure? And I think that should come first, honestly. Our family is not particularly good at that, I will say. But the other functions of the prophetic function, that can look different. That can be, what is your family involved in? What activities do you do together that are formative, that are going in the right direction, that have a point to them? And then in terms of kingship, it's kingship within the family, but it's also leadership and service outside of the family. But as to your point, what is it for? It's oriented to God, and our number one goal is to get our kids to heaven, to do our best, and to get our spouse to heaven, if we have one. And so that's what has to come first.
I'll just add briefly that these two both have points. I think that I guess what do you call it, the mechanics of teaching the values to the children is very much tied up with our behavior, showing them that they're loved, demonstrating that every day. But also the broader values, service you mentioned. When my children were little, I was a member of the Legion of Mary, and we would go out on Saturday mornings and visit the older and kind of ill members of the parish. And I kind of felt bad about it because in some ways it was taking time away from my children. But, we spent the rest of the weekend together and walked to church and things like that. And I have come to appreciate in more recent years that they both watched that and got something out of watching Dad go out to help the other people. So it helps.
Thank you. I was really struck by the comments around the table about some of the imperfections of the people that we have in our domestic church, whether they be someone that is the parent of your children that wasn't necessarily your first choice, whether it be parents of our own parents, Althea pointing at herself and thinking about our own personal imperfections. But I think there's something to remember about that, because I think about that as we need to find through their imperfections what are the values that they can bring, because as Quentin was sharing, they certainly have a love for us. They have a love for our children. And where do we find those things that they can bring to the table? And how can we help them bring those forward despite differences of opinion? And how do we set that forward? I think that's very challenging. And I think that leads us to a next point when we start talking about how we can teach those values in combinations with structures like the church children's liturgy, which is almost easy, I could imagine, but when they start going to school, how do we utilize the institutions of our community, taking from family, friends, and those imperfections, and then probably projecting even more imperfections of the community? How do we work with that?
I think both at church and at home, doing things with the children. I don't mean just going out and playing, but for example, we clean the house together. They would help. We would all pitch in with cooking and cleaning dishes. But even at church, I go to St. Patrick's downtown, which for a long time had both an English parish and a German-speaking parish. And the German-speaking parish was, by and large, older people. And so it kind of fell on, I noticed that nobody was serving Mass for a couple of weeks in a row. And at some point you feel like, well, I know how to serve Mass. And you get up and you do it. But then you can take the kids with you and teach them how to do it, And I think that has had a good effect. So I think being with them and, working with them like that.
I'm going to say something that is one of the things that maybe I shouldn't say today. I think that the institutions that we have to draw on are really weak. Really weak. And I just don't think that they can do what we need them to do. So as a parent, it is my job to provide that. And if it is not on offer, then I have to make it happen. And so we have done our best in our family to seek out opportunities and people that we feel are conducive to our mission. And we are working on that every day.
Yeah, I just agree with that. The Byzantine Church in Canada isn't great. It has these absolute pockets of light, and you really got to find them. There's like ethnic problems, there's all kinds of things. But the church that we go to is really wonderful, but it's very, very aged. When my wife and I arrived there 3 years ago, when we moved to Toronto, we, I think, dropped the median age by about 15 years, just the two of us, which both indicates the small amount of people that were there and their age. So we didn't really know what we were doing. My wife is a very beautiful singer, and so the priest immediately latched onto her because they didn't have a very strong cantor, and we became involved very quickly, much faster than we were anticipating. The liturgy basically depends on us at this point, which is very weird. And I think this is an interesting idea in terms of not allowing the institutions to dictate what we ought to do, but also that I think we actually have a duty to the institutions. And I've talked with this a lot about my father-in-law because he deals with this as well, but I'm not blaming anyone. I'm going to make a generalization. I would say that writ large in North America, we've had basically about a generation or two that just neglected its responsibilities. Now, that doesn't mean every person. I'm sure that there were many saints in those areas. I'm not saying it's everyone. But it's really weird to know what to do when, historically, where do you look for wisdom? You look to the aged. You look to those who have had experiences. And yet, we find ourselves in this bizarre situation where, like, you don't listen to them. Like, it's like they're telling you about, make sure that you invest your portfolio properly in an economy that's collapsing, and that it's all about just getting a house and nothing else matters, and it's just very odd. It's a very weird kind of orientation. And so I would say that I just completely agree. We have to kind of take on these formative roles in institutions perhaps before we ought to, which is very weird. However, what I have noticed is how insanely improved the community as a whole has become in the last 3 years. We now do many more extra liturgical activities. The liturgy itself is much more robust. The priest has started demanding things rather actively of the people in a way that he didn't when we arrived, and didn't for about 18 months after we arrived. Then the question is, how do you do that? And I think that this is exactly right. It has to start actually in the home, unfortunately. We're in a weird position where the domestic church is almost more powerful than the proper church. And I don't know what to do about that, because I think I'm a sinful person and I probably shouldn't be running a church, especially one that's guiding another church. But I don't see any other way. I don't know how else to get around this. I really should be in the audience. I want to be listening to other people talking, but maybe you can answer my questions.
As a Canadian, I really, for, most of my life, kind of expected people to just do things for me. There's a problem, the government will fix it. Or I pay taxes, so they will provide the things that I need. But the honest truth is that it is up to each one of us to provide our families for the things that we need. As far as the institutions, so we go to a wonderful, wonderful parish and beautiful priests, beautiful community, and I'm so grateful. I would do anything for them. But I think what is necessary in the times that we're in is to concentrate our efforts, right? So find something that's working, or the best that you can, and really concentrate your efforts there and try to build it. So, that's the Benedict option, I guess, that people have talked about for a number of times, but it's also the monastic tradition. And I think we know how to do this. We have this within our tradition. It's just that for a long time, it wasn't necessary for us to step up in this way. And it clearly is necessary now. And sorry, somebody has a question?
Yes, because what you were saying is really speaking to me in terms of being that younger generation having to step up to rebuild a church that has perhaps been neglected by the previous generation. So would you have any suggestions in terms of young people trying to step up where there's been a gap, but encountering that resistance from that generation who's neglected the church? That I'm finding myself in one of the situations. I do have a lot of buy-in from what I'm trying to propose, but there's still a lot of resistance as well.
I have a couple of thoughts. First of all, I think that we are infantilized in our culture. If I'm 25 years old and I think somebody should be doing something for me, no, I'm an adult. I need to be doing stuff for myself and for others. You know, like, so it's not true that we, you know, should get stuff handed to us. Like, we have this sense of entitlement in Canada, and that's just, like, that needs to go. It needs to go right now. So, yes, every baptized person has a mission to, you know, carry out in their church, and they should all be working on that. I don't think it's fair to say that people necessarily neglected the church or this and that. I think people are doing the best that they know how to do in the circumstances in which they find themselves. And, you know, the Catholic Church is ever reforming. There's never been a time in the church where people weren't like, hey, that needs to change. This is no good. Like, it's always like that, right? So we just have to persevere. We have to have fortitude to do it. You know, when people encounter resistance, I know what you're saying. Matthew knows what I think about this. Like, I would probably just ignore it. I don't know. You know, if things need to be done, they need to be done.
We can talk after. I think we can do
Okay, sorry, I apologize. I'm going to be a little academic for a second. I'm going to disagree with some of the things that were said this morning, although Dr. Sigourney, I think, corrected this a little bit with one of the questions that came up. The word ethics is actually crazy different than the word morals. It's a very different word. It's a Greek root, ethike, which the most direct translation of is character. That's what it means. Morals comes from mores, a Latin term meaning something approximating customs that, you know, especially Cicero concretizes into this new category. They both have relevance, they're both interesting, but the thing about ethics is that it's the wrong question. It's not like duty ethics or like utilitarianism where you're saying, what do I do? Ethics is the question of, how do I live? Who am I? It's a very different question, especially if you go with like the Aristotelian Thomistic tradition. And I think that this is a question we have to ask, and this might partly answer your question, is that, yes, we need to be like demanding excellence of ourselves, but if your demand of excellence makes you hateful, if it makes you rash, any of these things, we have to recognize that's also your character. And so there's this balancing act of saying, okay, I want to be excellent, I want others to be excellent, and of course, I mean, this is very hard in a Christian context, because all of this does not pair well with humility. That was not a virtue for Aristotle, so pulling from him is a little rough. But I do think that there is something about this that is wrapped up in everything we're talking about. The best form of self-criticism I've encountered is when I see my son do something that I do, and I hate it. Because I realize, it's like, oh, I'm bad, right? It's a deeper thing. And so I think that coming back to this idea of like, wait a second, what actually is ethical development? And realizing that you're never outside of it. You can never step outside and try to force something in. You're always in the midst of it. And so, yeah, I'm just rambling now.
Yeah, like basically, if we want to succeed in the mission that we are given, we have to ourselves be excellent first. You know, we don't, like, it comes from inside, right? It comes from the grace of God. It's not like some school that has to teach our kids morals. It's like, well, we have to do that, you know? And so I think because we have an institutional church, we feel that we should be able to look to that institutional church to help us, and we ought to, but that does not mean that they will do the work for us.
So I will ratify Quentin's observation that there appear to have been one or two generations that sort of abdicated a lot of their moral responsibility. And that has resulted, I think, in a lot of different circumstances in different parts of the world for different people. So I would go back to using Christ, the truth, and love as compass in whatever situation you're in Christian perseverance, asking, what would Jesus want me to do? But I'll also point out that I've been on both sides of it. At St. Patrick's, we had a social justice group, and of course it was a goal to attract younger people. And so younger people would show up and they'd propose a project, and instead of saying, well, that's a great idea, we got some challenges, let's figure this out, most of the people on there would say, well, we can't do that because we never did it, which is a little bit annoying. But I'm very much like the two of you. My daughter just found herself in Watson Lake, Utah, and she and her husband now basically run the mission church for whatever priest is going to be sent their way the next time a priest comes by. So, but by looking inside for what is the truth, what is love, what are the things I'm really capable of, you can do the job you need to do.
Thank you. I was actually particularly struck by Althea's points, and as much as I've got daughters that are 9 and 10 years old, we're only 3 years into mission. We've adopted our daughters, and I've acutely understood the challenges of seeing our shortcomings and our strengths, and how do we find those resources in the community? It's hard. You, as a Canadian, depend on things. We expect that our schools and all of the resources in our community will be there for us, and they don't have the same mission. They don't want to do the same thing for our children. And it's a shocking experience to go through that and have to reevaluate everything, to find medical professionals that support our values, to find schools that support our values. And so I think, what can we do? I mean, there's challenges even within the church, finding resources. There's a battle between, and again, Humanae Vitae, not so much Humanae Vitae, but the changes within the church of inviting more of the lay people to do more things. The previous generations didn't know how to do that, and we're finding our voices to do that, but there's challenges there. Where can we go in the Catholic community, and even to some extent the secular community? Where can we find those resources to help us as parents and as people who want to bring our children to God and ultimately get them into heaven? Where do we find those resources?
And you just have to look inside yourself and pray a lot, I think. My experience with that was, being a single father, I didn't have too many choices of what I could do with the kids for their education. And I was not infrequently surprised at some of the things my children said when they came home. You're like, wow, I wonder what they're teaching you at school. But, I would kind of patiently explain my own view of the world, and they could see that I lived it. And I think after a while, after experimenting a little bit, they found out what's true and what's not. And we're ready for that when they got to that point. Does that help at all? Althea, we're hoping.
I'm going to say something that is not going to be comforting, probably. So my oldest is 17. I think the things that have been the best things in our family's life journey and formation broadly fall into two categories. Category number one is the community of the Oratorian priests, because they do a very, very good job. They have a beautiful liturgy, they have beautiful music, they have a choir, your sons can serve mass, they have a lot of teaching, so they are a community of religious, and I think ideally that is where you would go for strengthening, to be strengthened, but they are few and far between this kind of community, right? So we have been very fortunate to have been able to be in that community, not through our entire faith journey, but for the last couple of years. But the other very impactful things that we have done as a family have all been some guy started something and just worked on it and offered it and did it because, maybe that guy had kids and he wanted his kids to participate. And so the most important activities that we've done have all been like that, where you had one or two people who were really committed and they did it and they offered it as a service, and it was for a time. Right? Because, people do this for a time, maybe 5 years or 8 years, and then they move on to other things. And the point is that we also have to do that,
I was just going to say that something that is perhaps misunderstood is the nature of intimacy, and that's very important here. I'm not talking about just between a husband and wife. I mean that in every form. My best friend is secular by all, he's baptized, but he's in no way affiliated with the church or anything. But I will talk to him before I'll talk to some of my Catholic friends who I just haven't known as long. I've known this friend that I'm talking about for 25 years. I don't remember my life without him. And The reason that I say that intimacy matters is that he actually knows me well enough that he knows where we disagree and will give me advice based on what he thinks my views are. Which, I mean, it's like this weird thing of that, you know, there's one way I could say that in my friendship with him, I don't know where I end and he starts. And the reason that I bring that up is that I think that intimacy is the thing that is lacking, in that even a lot of people's parochial relationships are not intimate. You know, they're just people we see on Sunday. And friendship is, I find it harder and harder to make friends as I'm getting older. And it's a deeply difficult thing, but it's the only answer to this, is that the best supports that my wife and I have found are in our friendships. And I mean, that doesn't mean that you can't develop more. It's very beautiful when friendships develop out of the church. But that intimacy that is necessary to love someone properly is the only way that I have found a sense of confidence in like who I'm trusting with my kids, insofar as I'm ever giving my kids to someone else, but as well to know me and give me adequate direction where I might need it, regardless of whether or not they're even faithful. That's actually not always the most important thing, even if it does have a value, of course.
Well, thank you, because you were actually introducing what I think would be sort of a closing point before we open it up to the room for questions, because we are at the 1:45 mark. I wanted the panel to think about, what do we need? I mean, I know there's a really long list, but what could help us with those things? But where do we put it? Where is it that we need it? I mean, to be timely here, is technology and AI part of a solution? What in secular society can be taken? What pieces could be taken to make up this mosaic? What could be taken together to find a solution? Is popular culture a part of this? What things do we, as an experienced panel, can say, nope, that's not even part of the solution, don't even try that, but maybe try going down these paths?
The only thing I can think is that the problem is that, you know, I think probably deliberately, the reason we're all here in this room is because I think people who want other things have deliberately kind of eroded the shared values that we have as a society. So that makes it very difficult. And I think we're never going to get anywhere until we get back to some sort of credible, solid, shared set of values. Now, we have to do what we can, obviously, you know, publicly, civically, to vote and things like that. But also we can work on smaller communities. There have been a few conversations at Catholic Conscience about, you know, how do we do like an open urban village? How do we do, you know, some kind of a Catholic co-op community? And I think the community support can make up for a lot of the things. You know, if we help each other. Even you were saying this, you know, the people that dedicate themselves to the project. It's easier to do that if you're kind of sharing resources or the availability of resources.
I think we have to stop dividing our church. I don't think it's true that people have necessarily widely abdicated responsibility. I think people have been greatly deceived by the culture, and it isn't good to sort of divide people by age or by stage. I think we're all in the body of Christ. You know, we need to be loving to everyone, but at the same time, you know, the last 100 years of cultural degradation that we've seen, we need to repudiate that. Not everything. You know, the fact that there's a panel of ladies sitting here is post-Vatican II, right? Mostly. And I mean, I'm grateful for that, but I think that mostly we need to go back and we need to do what we know how to do, and we need to look for tradition to figure out how to move forward. I think that the draws of the culture are very dangerous to the family and to the formation of children and everyone else. Like probably a lot of people in this room are on their smartphone more than they ought to be. Miles, I see he's on his phone right now. And I'm putting myself right in there. But like, we're at a point in the culture where we actually need to take active steps to hold it back. Like we have many technological idols, and I love technology, but we have many idols, and we need to push back on that. And I think concretely, we need to reclaim the culture that we had in the church and hold that really closely. We don't allow smartphones in our house, like for kids. My older ones have phones, but they have just like contact-related stuff on there, because they need to be able to grow free of these influences that are very, very strong, and then they can make their choices, right? But we need to hold what we know and do that.
I'm going to do something very, very practical, which is that my wife and I, about once a month or so, it changes depending on what's going on in our lives. We sit down and we try to have it's usually a hard conversation about where we're going, and making that explicit, because I think that we leave this implicit a lot of the time. For example, I'm in a university. The university has no idea what it's doing. That's why it's falling apart. There's no understanding of the goal. There's no telos. It's gone. Whereas if you can sit down and regularly have a conversation about what are we doing, right? And I intend, once our children are talking, to do the same thing with them. What are you doing, right? Where are you going? What's the purpose of all these pieces? And there's obviously gradations to this. It sounds almost kitsch, but it's having a 3, a 5, a 10-year plan is not irrelevant, and actually talking about it is very necessary. And then a little kind of double proverb that my father-in-law always talks about is that you can't be the best, be the enemy of the good, but you also can't let the good be the enemy of the better. And finding a sweet spot there is, I think, we're having this sense of orientation. For example, I'm never going to be some giant public intellectual. So my PhD studies, that's not what we're ordered to. And my wife had to tell me that at one point. And it was good. I was like, oh yeah, that's right, I'm a dad, I'm all these other things. I need to be ordered in that way. And I think that being able to expand that conversation out, we should have those conversations also with our pastors, right? What is the purpose of this church? Because I think a lot of people don't know anymore. My pastor perpetually complains that he's been explaining the same things for 3 years, right? But I think that having those conversations and having a very forward-looking orientation, not in a cheap, progressive sense, but in a very grounded, who am I? How do I become what I envision myself being? That's the most practical thing that I can continually come back to. And AI can't help with that.
I have to say something that also leads into the panel that I'm going to do at 3, which is education related. But if you think about where do you spend your time, right? And where does a child spend their time? Okay, so maybe you spend 1/3 of your day sleeping, okay, and then you spend maybe 1/3 of your day at work, or the child spends 1/3 of their day at school, and then you have maybe 1/3 of the day in the home. So for those 16 hours, we should be in an environment that is conducive to our reality, like who we are, right? So children of God, and we should be in an environment that is constantly seeking to form ourselves and our kids in virtue. And why are we here, right? And so when we surround ourselves with stupidity, TikTok, whatever, and we allow our children to go out into, say a school environment for 8 hours a day where they're surrounded by things that don't lead to what they ought to be as people, then we are doing a disservice to them, and we're doing a disservice to ourselves. So I think we have to really think very critically about how we actually lead our lives. What do we do with our time, and what do they do with their time? And we should be putting ourselves in environments that allow us to become who we actually are.
I agree.
So I think it's time for me to summarize what I think each of these esteemed panelists have brought forward and invite the room for any questions. I think what I've heard is relationships, people. Seek out people, whether they are of our Catholic community, secular, people who know us well, understand us, and seek out people within our community to solve these problems. Maybe it's just for a short period of time, 6 or 8 years, understand the strengths and the weaknesses, but I think it sounds to me like it's people that are going to solve the problems, working together regardless of age, overcoming the challenges that society, the secular world, technology might put in front of us. I think we just need to roll up our sleeves and work together.
I'll point out that no single cell phone.
So I'll take this opportunity to invite the room if they would like to have any questions or comments, anything they'd like to share with the panel. We have some time before the next session starts, or if you want to go off. Miles.
I just wanted to ask, short of interdicting or prohibiting cell phones, what one thing could the church at any level do, as you see it, to support the fact that it's not new?
What can the church do to help the families right now? What one thing?
Provide Catholic education. I'm sorry, but I really mean that. I really mean that. You know, what we do, what we call a Catholic education, we have really abdicated our educational system. You know, you cannot hire people who are not Catholic and who do not have the same mission as you do to inculcate and to drive the mission forward that you want in your family. So, you know, that's our fault. You know, we're like, oh, just go to school. Someone else will deal with that. That's our fault. Okay, so like what has happened to our Catholic school system is that there are people in the Catholic school system who do not share the mission of the people in this room. And that is just a fact.
Sorry, I'll send it over. I want to add to the point that when the government started funding Catholic education is the beginning of it no longer being a Catholic school system.
Yeah, that's good.
We wanted free education.
Yeah.
Get what you pay for.
I would say that I think that this came up already, but my impression, and I think that this is a secular influence, but there's like a real infantilizing of children beyond when they're infants. And there's a number of ways that this manifests, like very practically. One of them is that children should be in the regular church service. They shouldn't be at a separate liturgy. What is going on? Do we think that it's not formative for them too? Like, that's crazy. It's one thing maybe if you want to have a separate liturgy that's slightly more pitched to them and then they return for the actual service itself. I don't even like that, to be honest. But there's a way in which we're treating kids like they don't have agency. I mean, it was mentioned, I think it was Dr. McQueen mentioned earlier that subsidiarity, like part of the logic is allowing those who can do something to do it. You don't kind of superimpose upon them. And man, everything that I see with kids is just perpetually doing things for them. I'm sure my son would love for me to do more than I do for him. He probably hates that I'm saying this, but I think that that's a big thing, is that as an Eastern Christian, like you have an Eastern tradition, there's a constant, like especially in the Orthodox Church, they like bang on about Augustine being wrong, which he's not. And one of them is that they really don't like the doctrine of original sin. The reason the doctrine of original sin is so important is that what it means is that Augustine is saying that children are rational. He's saying they can choose. He's granting them more agency than the Orthodox are in saying, oh, no, they can't sin. Yes, they can. And this is like, again, it's like these like little pockets that you'll see of like, wait a second, that's not treating kids like a human being. And that would be something that I think the church, like it's not that bad, but it could do more. It could be more clear on this. It could be more forceful. And I would love to see that as an external influence on my own children. I would really welcome that.
Anyone who has a toddler knows that original sin is real. I would just like to say, what the Catechesis of the Good Shepherd does, I think is a really good balance between being respectful of children's capacities and also not making it silly.
Yeah, I'm glad you pointed that out, Althea, because having been involved in the children's liturgy at a parish level, it becomes daycare for children for 20 minutes. And I really try to when I'm involved in that, okay, this is what you do, this is what this means, so they can gain an understanding at the age and stage that they're at. Because unfortunately, if we sit and color and run around and sing songs, that was all I got out of my Catholic education. And that's what they're doing in the liturgy now. You need to teach what everything in the Mass is all about, and the Church isn't doing that. But there are places we can find that. Any other questions or comments? Yeah. One more question. Oh, sorry, 2 questions, and we're at time. Quickly.
I was wondering, you mentioned recently having different beliefs within people group, and how do you go about it? To not just to not increase the value of your own belief system, but still run some involvement. How do you also put limits and stuff like that?
Yeah, this is incredibly difficult, and that's the first thing to acknowledge. My wife and I perpetually talk about how we're failing to do this adequately. But I would say that it's sort of what is this? I'm a good Catholic, so I have no idea what the verse is. But I think it's Matthew chapter 6. This whole idea, it's either the end of chapter 5 or the beginning of chapter 6. This whole idea of washing your face so that others don't know you're fasting. Right? And there's an awkwardness to that because I tell my children they're fasting. I mean, we don't really make them fast. It's just we have a vegetarian meal. It's little things we're very concerned about my dad and my stepmother are actively hostile to religion. So it's really, and what I do is if we have dinner with them, I really quietly say grace with my son right as we sit down. And just to make sure, because he won't eat unless we say grace, and then we just move on. And eventually there'll have to be a point where I explain to him why we're doing that. And the idea will be that we don't want to be haughty. That itself is part of the witnessing, and it's gonna suck for my kids. I know that there's gonna be a moment where they're like, "Grandma and Grandpa don't do this." I'm like, "Yeah, I know." It's gonna be hard, but I think that there's a way in which even that mechanism has to be built in the sense of we're not being triumphalistic. We're not pushing this on other people in that way. And I think that itself is a kind of lesson for them. So in an odd way, I would just embrace it. And then just try to be clear with my kids when I'm alone with them and being able to talk to them and making sure that they understand in a charitable way.
I think if it's possible, it's really important that they don't feel left out. The people in your family that maybe aren't aligned with you, because really we want them to be, and they deserve our love, and they deserve our filial affection, right? So parents gave life to you, right? They deserve a lot, and so we don't want people to feel like they're not part of it. I've definitely heard that from family members before, that they feel like they're left out or they're not part of it or this. So I think actually actively extending a welcome in whatever way is possible is really important.
I know there's one more question, but we are moving on to the next panel, but I do want to hear the question, and then I can set you up with one of the panelists to speak about that. What was your question, Teresa? Okay, then we'll speak afterwards, okay? So I want to thank everyone for being here this afternoon, and we'll continue on with another domestic church panel about the family looking outward. Thank you for being here.